This meeting is being recorded.
It's 131. Oops. Put up 131. We've changed the other one. So just leave 131. Good morning. Welcome to First Unitarian Universalist Church of Lynchburg. We're glad that you're here, whoever you are, whatever your beliefs, whatever your age, and whomever you love, you are welcome here. As we work together for justice, compassion, and peace, we also acknowledge with humility that our buildings sit on Monacan land. My name is Tina Barnes. My husband and I have been members of the church for some 40 years, and we're happy to be here. This is actually our first time in the church since February of 2020. So it's a momentous occasion for us. If you're with us for the first time, we're glad you chose to be here this morning to participate in this service and for this church community that we love. If you'd like to receive our monthly newsletter and Friday email updates, please fill out the virtual visitor card found on the website at uulynchburg.org under Sunday services, or fill out the yellow card in the chair seat in front of you and place it in the offering basket during the offering. Please take note of the announcements in the order of service. You can find them on Zoom, and you can find them in the Friday news blast. Are there any announcements for this morning from the congregation? Then, if there are none, please join me in lighting the chalice and saying the chalice lighting words. May the light we now kindle inspire us to use our powers to heal and not to harm, to help and not to hinder, to censure, not to curse, to serve you, O Spirit of life. This morning I have a reading 435. We come together this morning to remind one another to rest for a moment on the forming edge of our lives, to resist the headlong tumble into the next moment until we claim for ourselves awareness and gratitude, taking the time to look into one another's faces and see there the communication, the reflection in our own eyes. This house of laughter and silence, memory and hope, is hallowed by our presence together. Please join me in singing hymn number 131, Love Will Guide Us. Please stand as you are able or care to.
It's Now I'd like to invite all the young ones and young at heart to join me in the front for Time for All Ages. All right. So today we're going to be reading a book called It Takes a Village. What does it take to change the world? Sometimes it takes a child to make a village. We all have a place in the village, a job to do, and a lot to learn. Kids don't come with instructions, but neither do grown-ups. Every child needs a champion, or two, or three, or more, and the right tool to get the job done. Every family needs help sometimes. Kindness and caring and sharing matter. Playing matters too. And resting, because the world is in a hurry, but children are not.
Yes, we are.
I don't know. Do you sometimes get called the pokey little puppy?
Yeah.
I've
been told that a lot.
Have you? Well, you and Nora have something in common. The village needs every one of us to help and every one of us to believe in each other. Children are born believers and citizens too. Let us build a village worthy of all children. The end. Look what they built, working together.
A village.
Yeah, with a really cool playground. It was a short story, but that's okay. So what I like about this story is it talks about how we all have to work together to help one another, right? And in church today, the grown-ups are going to be talking about a place called Ukraine and how the people there need lots of help right now and why they need help. And upstairs in our classes, we're going to be talking about how we love one another in our whole community. So we've talked about how we love ourselves, and we've talked about how we love our friends and our family. And now we're going to be talking about how we can love our community, our church community, and our neighborhoods, and our whole world.
Hey, my home is in the neighborhood.
Yeah, your home is in a neighborhood. We all have neighborhoods, right? Yeah. Yeah, we've talked about it. All right, let's see. Whose turn is it to help light the chalices?
Me.
Nora and Leah, you want to help? All right, so I'm going to invite Nora and Leah to help light the chalices, and then we will go upstairs. Okay, you can go next week, okay?
Hey, I did do my best again.
Yeah?
I said thank me.
Oh, then Nora? Nora is just about to turn 6.
It's already
Today, we take an offering of our gifts for the work of this congregation. The monetary support of our members and friends, along with the generous gifts of time and talent that it takes to make this church possible. If you found this church to be of value in your life, then I invite you to use the offering baskets here in the sanctuary, or if you're on Zoom, you may make a donation through the website, through PayPal, or send a check to the church. And so we take an offering of gifts generously offered and greatly received. It's a tradition in our community to share the joy. I really want to thank Emily for this morning. She chose all the music that's written by Ukrainian composers. So I really appreciate that. This morning, we are at long last pleased to have Gerald Sherayko. We started talking on the Sunday Services Committee months and months ago about doing a service about Ukraine to look at the historical perspectives and what's going on with the war. And we said at that time, the war will be over by then, but it'll be a good look back. Little did we know it would still be ongoing. But we are thrilled to have Jerry with us. He's a Theodore Jack Professor of History and Professor of Museum and Heritage Studies at Randolph College. He and his wife Carolyn moved to Lynchburg in 1998 when Jerry accepted a position at Randolph-Macon Women's College. His main field of research is teaching 20th century German history. While at Randolph, he has taught a variety of courses on German history, Russian history, and modern European history. He's our go-to guy for all things history. Recently, he's branched out to offering more courses in the field of public history, including one focusing on race and memory, and another one on memory of the Second World War. The question of memory and memorialization shapes all of his courses, including the seminars he's led overseas to countries including Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Great Britain, Ireland, the Czech Republic, and Germany. He has or is serving on the board of many local and state organizations, including the Holocaust Education Foundation of Central Virginia, the Friends of Rivermont, the Lynchburg Historical Foundation, the Jones Memorial Library, the Pierce Street Gateway, and the Virginia Conference of the American Association of University Professors. We are so pleased. Please welcome Jerry Sherayko to talk to us about Ukraine and all of the historical perspectives, all of the historical perspectives. In
just 1,200 years. So I'll do it as quickly as possible. So let's move this back a little bit. Now, relations between Russia and Ukraine have been strained since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Ukraine was known as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union and has remained politically, militarily, and economically important to Russia ever since. Precisely why there's a dispute over the sovereignty of Ukraine is a complex question rooted in the region's history. It's very old history. It's a story, again, more than 1,000 years in the making. For much of the story, Ukraine did not exist, at least not as an independent sovereign state. So the name Ukraine will be used here to help identify the region around what we used to call Kiev, because that's the Russian pronunciation, and Kyiv, because that's more Ukrainian. So I'll be using Kyiv in this as a pronunciation. So the name Ukraine will be used to help identify that region around Kyiv that's so central to this story. Crimea is an important part of the story too, and its history forms a part of that relationship between Russia and Ukraine. I don't know if I got back up there or not. Tell me when it's up, then I'll turn around and just point out some things. So, yeah, so for those who don't know, that's Crimea, of course, the Black Sea, Ukraine's there, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, above that is Estonia. All those countries there were part of the Russian Empire, and they were part of the Soviet Empire. And in the early 90s, 1991 in particular, that's when they began to break free. So, but above that, of course, is Scandinavia, and that's going to be part of the story as well. So. Kyiv, of course, the capital city of Ukraine, a millennium ago, was the heart of what was known as the Kievan Rus state. This is why it's so important. The Russians see the founding of their state, of their country, of their culture, of their people being in Kyiv, which, of course, currently is not in Russia. But of course, they have a goal to make it so. Through the 8th and 11th centuries, Norse traders from Scandinavia sailed the rivers down from the Baltic, which you can see up there, down to the Black Sea. Mostly Swedish in origin, they found their way to the Byzantine Empire, which is the Ottoman Empire, which is now modern Turkey. And so they went all the way as far down as the Black Sea. And they began to settle around what is modern-day Kyiv. They were referred to as the Rus, which seems to have the origins in the word men who row, since they were so closely associated with the rivers and their ships. So even the founding leaders of the Rus were actually Scandinavian, not Slavic, and that becomes complicated for Russians too, to kind of embrace that. And the founding area is Kyiv, which is in modern-day Ukraine, part of the problem as well. And of course, the people that merged with Slavic and Baltic and Finnic tribes there, and eventually they became known as the Kievan Rus. The Rus tribes and their ancestors of those who still bear their name today are the Russians, the Belarusians, and the Ukrainians. And so they are separate peoples yet connected. And again, that makes it complicated as well. By the 12th century, Kyiv was seen as the mother of Rus cities, and really was known as the capital of the Kievan Rus state. The rulers are called the Grand Princes of Kyiv, and they were acknowledged as the rulers of the Rus or Russian people. The association of Kyiv with the early heritage of the Rus as the root of the Russian people means that city holds over the collective imaginations of those beyond modern Ukraine, for Belarusians and for Russians as well. And it's so important that the birth of Russia now lies beyond Russian borders, if you want to understand what's going on. This 1,000-plus-year-old connection is the beginning of an explanation of the present tensions and of the war itself. People are always willing to fight over places that exert a pull on them. And again, it goes back to their heart and soul, who they think they are. Mongol invasion. So, 1223, the irresistible expansion of the Mongols reached the Kievan Rus state. Mongolia is here on this map, right? So, we actually know the date, May 31st, 1223, the Battle of the Kolka River. The Mongols, who were not peoples that were known very well in this area, all of a sudden come swept in and decisively defeated the people in this area. And then they left, but then they came back. So that's 1223. In 1237, they came back not to occupy this area, but to get tribute. So they weren't expanding their land mass in order to move there, but they wanted was tribute. Tribute means things like gold and slaves, among other things. And so this was well over a century of a direct control of these outside peoples. And you don't want to go too far in trying to explain history, but geography and history are mixed together. This is an area that has been invaded by peoples, and this is the first major one. The breakup of the Kievan state starts with this. And much of the area was under the control of Mongols, the dominion of the Golden Horde, as it was called then, for centuries. Different khanates, different khans would rule this area, but it was ruled, again, not direct occupation as much as we have the military threat that can sweep back in, make sure to pay us what we're asking. It was during that period that Kyiv was sacked several times, and so Kyiv begins to reduce in its importance, and Moscow begins to rise up. Right? If Kiev is there, you can see where Moscow is. It's a little further away for where the center of where the Mongols were. So the Mongols were in that area as well. So one city, Kyiv, begins to diminish. Moscow begins to rise. A new focal point. It doesn't mean you forget about the old one. As the control of the Golden Horde slipped over the years, Ukraine was now absorbed into a small country that most of us don't know much about, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, because at that point, Lithuania was a major force. And eventually, Lithuania and Poland comes together, called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So again, Kyiv is the center, the Golden Horde, the Mongols come in, Moscow begins to rise. Eventually, that area around Kyiv is beginning to be dominated by the Poles and Lithuanians. So again, conquest, outsiders, but still the heartland. Cossacks. Now, what are Cossacks? These are military men known for their horsemanship. They're mostly linked with the area around Kyiv throughout history. They began to resist this control of the Poles and Lithuanians because they're related peoples, at least the Poles are, they're Slavic, but they're not themselves. And so they're dominated by this outside group. And they begin to say that we would like to move more toward Moscow as the center, because Russians and these people around Kyiv are more connected than these Poles and Lithuanians. And so what happens is Cossacks begin to fight against this Polish-Lithuanian occupation. While they're doing that, the Grand Prince of Moscow is beginning to do, the princes, I should say, something that's called the Gathering of Russia, very famous in Russian history, of bringing lands together under their control. That gathering in Russia is completed, at least how they would define it then, in the 1520s under the Grand Prince, one of the Grand Princes of Moscow, was called Vasily III. And so this Russian state that's beginning to emerge around Moscow has a great deal of appeal to the people around Kyiv, let's call them now Ukrainians, because at least there is more of a connection between Russians and Ukrainians than there is between Ukrainians and Poles and Lithuanians. And this is a lot going on, over the course of centuries. But still, dominated by outside forces, you can imagine, we don't really have, what is the heart of the United States? New York City? That's my heart, because I grew up in New Jersey, so you're always longingly looking at the city. But it's tough to say, we don't have that kind of concept here. But for them, again, outsiders from the East, outside over the course of centuries, now the West. 1652, the Cossacks signed a treaty with the now Grand Prince, who's now, they're calling himself Tsar, Caesar, Emperor, saying that we will formally be part of this Muscovite, Russian-dominated state. It was Ivan the Terrible, the first started calling him Tsar since 1547. This means that there's a total break between these Cossack peoples and the Poles and Lithuanians, because they have formally, in that year, 1652, say, we will align ourselves with the Grand Duchy of Moscow, the leader of that, now called Tsar. And so the USSR, the Soviet Union, would see that year, that 1652 treaty, the Treaty of Pereyaslav, as the sort of founding connection that solidifies this connection, that reunifies Ukraine back with Russia formally after it had been lost for so long, since the invasion of the Golden Horde. All the Rus people are under one leader, a Tsar, who's Russian. And so it goes back to the 800s, but now in the 1600s, this formal connection between Ukrainians and Russians, at least that's how the Russians or the Soviets would see it in the 20th century, formally connected once again. Now, as far as Crimea was the last of the areas still dominated by Mongols. Eventually, the Ottoman Empire down here takes it over. And under Catherine the Great in the late 1700s, that's when it's finally conquered to be part of Russia, 1783, for the exact date. Catherine the Great was very interesting. I would argue probably the most significant Russian leader, more so than Peter in some ways. The amount of land that she conquered, the amount of art she bought, the amount of power she accumulated for herself. And strangely, she happens to be German. There's a whole story. She's a German princess. She comes into power. She had a very unpopular husband who is overthrown and murdered early on. There's a whole story about whether or not she knew it or didn't know it. But nevertheless, by the late 18th century, the late 1700s, the Mongols are finally gone. And this has been a long time. It's 1200s now. It's just, the 1700s. It's 1783, 18th century. So for the first time in 600 years, the Mongols are no longer a presence, no longer a threat. When Crimea is taken over, it doesn't mean that all the peoples leave. There were Mongols there. They stay there. That's why Russia is such a multi-ethnic empire. It was also under Catherine that began to expand more and more into the Asian areas, all the stans that people might know about. So, early 19th century. So you have this growing Muscovite state that doesn't call it Muscovy, hasn't been called that for a while. It's called Russia. This Russian Empire that's expanded and expanded, whether you're talking about under Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century, under Peter the Great in the late 16th, late 17th, early 18th centuries, and under Catherine in the late 18th century. This is now the largest country on earth. It is multi-ethnic, multicultural, as we call it now, largest country on earth. But it doesn't mean that all the people in that country actually are solidly behind wanting to still stay in that country. The 19th century is a time of nationalism. It starts in the early 19th century, it really takes off later. And so Ukrainians, way back in the 1652, might have said, yes, we'll pledge our allegiance to the Russian leaders. But there's a long time from 1652 to the early 1800s. And during the early 1800s, a unique Ukrainian culture begins to emerge. There was always a unique language related to, but not exactly like Russian. And it begins to emerge at this time. And much of it, they go back to that Cossack heritage, that sort of idea of strong military might. This is the 19th century after all. Horsemanship, there's still the era of horses. And so there's this really strong sort of growing affinity toward our uniqueness within this Russian empire. Now, the Russians themselves see the Ukrainians, Belarusians, as fellow Russians, but with a twist. They see themselves as the core. I mean, we Russians as great Russians. They refer to the Belarusians and the Ukrainians as the little Russians, and that diminutive, there's a statement being made there. You are Russians, from our point of view, but not exactly as good as us, and that's going to mean something too. 1804, for the first time, there's in years and years and years, there's really a separatist movement in Ukraine, maybe the first time ever, really. The Russians respond, we're going to ban the Ukrainian language in schools. We are not going to allow that separate culture to threaten our empire from within. This is not going to happen. Through the course of the early part of the 19th century, Russia becomes both more powerful, but also weaker. Industrialization that starts in places like England, Netherlands, what eventually becomes Belgium, the United States, France, doesn't really hit Russia, and that's going to mean something. Everyone here has heard of the Crimean War. You probably haven't thought about it much. What's the Crimean War all about? The Crimean War is Russia wants to assert itself on the world stage. It is the world's largest country, but during the 19th century, a lot of those other powers are going elsewhere to conquer areas. This is the early part where you begin to see, particularly Africa, this is early stages of the French, eventually the Belgians, certainly the English. And what the Russians want is to be able to get out of the Black Sea, get into the Mediterranean, get to the rest of the world for financial reasons, for military reasons, for imperial reasons. You might imagine everyone else doesn't want them to do that. The Russians lose the Crimean War. Very famous, charge of the Light Brigade, Florence Nightingale, right, officialization of nursing. So some things that are really important come out of this war. But what happens here is that they lose and lose badly because they are so industrially backwards, which means their weapons are so backwards. It is from that embarrassment of how badly they lost this. And by the way, the result is you're not allowed to have any military presence in the Black Sea, never mind letting it go out through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles and getting to the rest of the world. Out of this, there's that sense that Russia is weak. Out of this comes the actually emancipation of the serfs. 2 years before we have our Emancipation Proclamation. Serfdom is in effect slavery. They do that not because of some sort of humanitarian idea that slavery or serfing is wrong. It's because serfdom is weak, right? Serfs and slaves are not necessarily the most motivated workers. It's keeping us backwards. We need to finally catch up with the rest of the world. We cannot be humiliated the way we were in this Crimean War. As far as Ukraine, nationalism doesn't, let's say, have a huge upsurge because of the Crimean War, but through the 19th century, where nationalism is turning into hyper-nationalism, Ukrainians are feeling this as well. 1876, the ban on teaching the Ukrainian language that was put in place in 1804 was extended to the prohibition and publication of books in Ukrainian, performance of plays in Ukrainian, delivery of lectures in the Ukrainian language. And so the Russians are trying to tamp down this because, again, they, like the Ottoman Empire or the Austrian Empire, if they allowed individual peoples to exert themselves too much, the whole thing could fall apart. World War I is an absolutely fascinating topic that I could talk about forever, but I won't. But in the middle of World War I, there's a Russian Revolution. 1917, there were actually two Russian revolutions. Let's go with the communist one. That was the second one. Out of this, Ukraine became independent very briefly, but then soon became part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, Soviet Union. Of course, the USSR is going to be a dominant force in world politics for the rest of the 20th century. 1922, Ukraine and Russia were two of the signatories that founded the USSR. At that point, were the Ukrainians equal to the Russians? Not really. I don't think they had a lot of choice in this, but they are going to be part of this new union. Ukraine, again, as I said very much earlier, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, sweeping fertile plains becomes the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, is providing grain and food for the rest of the country. It is about as productive as the northern plains are in the United States. It's some of the most productive land on earth. But remember, nationalism, which was already emerging in the early 19th century, expanding in the late 19th century, doesn't go away. Most productive land experiences what's called a terror famine in the 1930s. So when tying back to the sort of fraught relations between Ukrainians and Russians, this is a major part of that. This happens in the early 30s. But at this point, Joseph Stalin is in charge of the Soviet Union. That's also a very interesting story, how he comes to power. The Holodomor was a state-sponsored famine. Again, most productive land. So why are they hungry? Because the Russian government, led by Stalin, who himself actually isn't Russian, he's Georgian. He's Georgian. Yeah. Decides, you want to control the Ukrainians? Let's murder them. That'll show them. And that's what happens. Crops were seized and sold to overseas markets. Part of that was, we need money for our industrialization, which was true. That's what Stalin was doing. Millions died in forced industrialization in the early 30s. But within Ukraine, you have starvation. You have people growing all this food, having all this livestock, and Russian troops coming in and taking it from them. Taking also all their pets and all that too, because pets can serve other purposes when you're hungry. I'll leave it at that. They were determined to starve out this population, to break their spirit, to break their ability to ever push back on the unity that was the USSR. Up to 4 million Ukrainians were killed, or starved to death during this time. This is the 1930s. There are probably maybe just a few, but this is living memory. This is certainly stories that people can tell you now that their grandparents told them about the starving times, not because of something that happened with the weather that you could not control, but because the Soviet Russian government did that to us. This is the early 30s. Second World War hits the Soviet Union in 1941. Germans invade June 22nd. Ukraine, because it's in the western part of the country, is one of the first areas, is totally overrun by the Germans. 4 million, interesting, same number, but it is, 4 million Ukrainians are evacuated to the east. We need them, meaning the Soviet Union needs them, for workers and for fighters later. So this is a massive upheaval. The Germans come marching in, many millions, there's still tens of millions of people behind, unfortunately, move to the east. One of the things, really smart things that Stalin does is he moves a bunch of factories beyond the Ural Mountains. The Ural Mountains are like the Appalachian Mountains, meaning they're not very tall, but they're far away from the front. That's what really saves the Soviet Union in this war. And he moves people. Of course, people don't have a choice. Because interestingly, when the Germans came in, they said, let's make a deal. We'll give you independence if you fight with us. And initially, some Ukrainians did fight with the Germans against the Soviet government. It makes sense. The Soviet government just tried to murder them just a few years earlier. But of course, the Germans had no inclination truly to give independence to Ukraine, and so they reneged on that. Not surprisingly, a lot of the Nazis' treaties and promises were broken. After all, yeah, they were Nazis. So Ukrainians suffered greatly in the early 30s. They were suffering greatly under the Germans during the Second World War. The population of Jews in the world, the largest population actually by that point was the United States, because so many people had to move to the United States to escape pogroms, the murder of Jews within the Russian Empire. But within Europe, Poland's number one, Soviet Union's number two as far as the Jewish population. 1.5 Ukrainian Jews are murdered during the Second World War, on top of all the other non-Jewish Ukrainians that are killed. One of the most famous events in the Holocaust, Babi Yar. This is a ravine where in 2 days, over 37,000 people were murdered and thrown into this ravine. That's right outside of Kyiv too. Timothy Snyder, a very famous historian out of Yale, has called this area Bloodlands for a reason. This area of Eastern Europe between the Germans and the Russians and so forth. The war, in 1943, the war finally turns against the Germans, the Battle of Stalingrad, which is beyond Ukraine. Counteroffensive means now they're moving back through Ukraine. By November of 43, Ukraine is liberated. But of course, you might imagine with the Nazis coming through the first time, when the Nazis come back, they have a scorched earth policy. They're going to destroy everything so there's nothing left for the people. We might lose, but we're not going to let you have any advantage with that. The fight for Western Ukraine actually lasts longer. I should have said that was Eastern Ukraine. They're not finally liberated until October of 44. So it's a very long fight within Ukraine. Somewhere between 5 and 7 million Ukrainians died. That's on top of the 4 million who died from the forest famine in the early 30s. The war is over, the Soviets win, but at a right cost. There's about 1 million more Ukrainians died during a famine, not a forced famine, but a famine because everything is broken down in 46, 47. Pre-war levels of food production would not be regained until the 1960s. And so this is an area that has suffered greatly in the 20th century. Did not see many advantages of being dominated by Russians. Did not see many advantages of being within the Soviet Union. Certainly no advantages of trying to work with Nazi Germany either. As far as Ukraine again, 1954, the USSR formally gives Crimea to the to Ukraine. Why not? It's all part of one country anyway. Again, it didn't make any difference. Might as well have the Ukrainians administer it because it's hanging off of Ukraine. It doesn't mean they're thinking of independence. So let's fast forward to the 80s, because Ukraine happens to be in our consciousness more than we might remember. Chernobyl is also in Ukraine. Of course, it was part of the Soviet Union. That disaster in April 1986, still the worst one. Fukushima is right up there with it, unfortunately. During a test procedure in the reactor, power decrease made the reactor unstable. There is an absolutely fascinating HBO miniseries that came out about 3 years ago. It says so much about both the disaster itself and about the problem of having a secretive government that doesn't admit its mistakes. It's well worth watching. It's 6 hours long, but it's well worth watching. So there's a meltdown, subsequent explosion, one of the worst disasters in world history, ongoing health issues in this area. There is still an exclusion zone that, interestingly, animals seem to be able to survive in it quite nicely, but people can't. You can go tour it briefly. And it is something because it's locked in time. The people, when they left, said they will be back in a couple of days, and they've never been back. But that Chernobyl disaster, according to the last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, was really, in his mind, the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. Because they covered it up initially, which meant it made it worse than it needed to be as far as the suffering. Again, it's in Ukraine. 5 years after that, there's, again, an interesting long story about the collapse of communism in Europe. 5 years after that, the Soviet Union collapses. That's 1991. Ukraine was one of the signatories, the document disbanding the Soviet Union, which on the surface said it's now going to be an independent state. They have elections, a referendum. Referendum, quote, do you support an act of declaration of independence of Ukraine? 32 million people voted. That was 84% of the population that could vote. 92.3% of them say, yes, we want to be independent. So that's not even close. In the presidential election, 6 candidates ran, all backing the yes campaign. Nobody was saying, let's stay with the Soviet Union or stay with Russia. The first president, his name is Leonid Kravchuk, is not particularly notable, except he was the first president democratically elected in an area of the world that had never had a democratically elected president. For that reason, he is certainly notable. As far as nuclear weapons, and I want to go on for so, Ukraine now becomes the 3rd largest holder of nuclear weapons in the world because a whole bunch of the weapons that the Soviets had are now there. Agreements are made, and this is going to affect the war now. Ukrainians give up on their weapons. They don't want to hold on to these weapons. The treaties, negotiations, a lot of them end up going to Russia. Some of them were destroyed, but that means they do not have a nuclear force. They didn't want one. And of course, that's what's behind some of the fear today. They don't have one, which is fine. The Russians do. That's not so fine. As far as political developments since then, democracy has been uneven. It's new. You got to learn. Certainly, we can talk about our own democracy, how it might have been working out, let's say, in the early 1800s, and how flawed that was, but that's a topic for another day. By 2014, though, there is a great deal of unrest in Ukraine. There's more, but I'll skip to that because I want to get to the end before I get to this time signal. Yeah, I'm going to wrap it up. So, 2014, there was a revolution. It was called the Revolution of Dignity, or also called the Maidan Revolution. That was when the president at the time refused to sign a document that would create a stronger connection between Ukraine and the European Union. In that revolution, 130 people were killed, including 18 police officers. That led to early presidential elections. So Petro Poroshenko was elected. He was there, then he loses to now our current president, of course, Volodymyr Zelensky. But it's during this time that Ukraine becomes so clearly, we want to be part of the European Union, we want to be part of NATO. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, former parts of the Soviet Union, are part of the EU and a part of NATO. Ukraine, being part of the EU and of NATO, cannot be accepted by Russians, at least Russians who are going to focus on their long and deep history of this connection. It is their heartland, their soul, the beginnings of their culture are with the enemy. That's how they see it. And that's what makes this so complicated. If it was just an old-fashioned, let's grab some land from another people, we can get that. This is much more complicated. This is in no way justifies anything that Vladimir Putin. There's nothing you can justify that Vladimir Putin has done in his entire life that I would ever justify. But that's what makes this so complicated, is that's why a few years earlier, before all this, they took back Crimea. And so where we are here, and it's very difficult to figure out where we're going to go with this, is the relationship between Russia and Ukraine has always been complex. It's rooted in their shared history going back 1,200 years. The Russians have viewed Ukraine as a province of Russia, not as an independent state, even after they declared their independence. They see that their goal of being part of the EU and part of NATO as undermining everything that Russia stands for and as a threat to their own security. So we see this as a good thing. They see this as a direct attack. And so when we try to figure out why this war is so vicious, why this war keeps going on, why it doesn't make any sense, it doesn't make any sense on some level. But if you know a little bit about the history, there's a lot of sense there. The shame of this is, of course, thousands upon thousands of people are dying because of this. I don't have time enough to read, but if you can read any personal stories of people that you might know or know of in Ukraine, do that. Do what you can to give whatever money you can to whatever organizations that are out there. But I will tell you, the last thing I'll say, the expressions of sadness and remorse, and that's perfectly fine. Expressions of sadness and remorse didn't save Jews during the Holocaust, and they're not saving Ukrainians. Actions, money, supporting the right politicians who might do something about this. There's been talk within the House that maybe we'll do less for Ukraine. This is a very dangerous thing. If we don't keep stepping it up, for good or for ill, we have the capacity to do something about this. If we don't keep doing something and maybe do more, the dying and the war will continue. And truly, if not now, when? And if not us, who? Yeah, thank you for listening.
Jerry and I were fortunate to share a student from Ukraine some years ago. Amazing young woman. I spent a lot of time online reading through the speeches of a very unlikely leader in Zelensky, who's doing such a good job at the main tenet of all of his speeches, which number in the hundreds. The tagline that he has is, "We are strong because we're united. We're united because we're strong." And in every one of his, pretty much every one of his speeches, also a core tenet is for Ukrainians to love and support each other at all costs, to help each other at all costs. And it's just the most amazing thing to read again and again and again. Support each other, love each other, help each other. We are one. So thank you so much, Jerry. I invite you now to sing a hymn which is not in your order of service. We changed that to hymn number 110. Boy, did I just learn a lot. That's right, isn't it? 110? No, you said it didn't matter. Oh my God.
No, it doesn't matter to me. I can play them all. Pick one.
It's 159 in the.
I know, but Rick, help me. I think it's 110 is what we decided on. Yeah.
Great. Please rise in body or spirit.
You're right. It was 159.
We can sing that one too.
Would y'all mind singing one more hymn? 159, because we'd really chosen this for a very specific reason. I'm sorry.
Okay. We'll sing them all.
thank you. That was an important song you picked out. So please join me in saying the words for extinguishing the chalice. As we do that, we extinguish this flame, but not my reading to end this day is, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. I'm going to speak for Jared and say if you got questions or anything, brief for you for the next couple days. Thank you all. Thank you.